In the last years of the 1800s, the British Empire stretched across the world like a giant blanket. It covered lands in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and beyond. In London, people walked proud, believing their nation ruled the seas, the skies, and even time itself. They read newspapers that spoke of progress, order, and civilization. But far away from the neat streets of London, in places like India, the truth was different. In Calcutta, a city hot and loud filled with markets, temples, and crowded streets, a young woman named Eleanor Thorne worked quietly in a tall stone building. The building belonged to the British government. Inside, men in stiff collars and polished shoes moved papers from one desk to another. They spoke in low voices and avoided looking out the windows where the real India lived, poor, restless, and growing tired of foreign rule. Eleanor was not like the other clerks. She was only 26, with sharp eyes and a mind that asked too many questions. She had come to India 2 years earlier, full of hope. She believed in duty and service and making things better. Her father had been a school teacher who told her, "Truth is the only compass." Now she sat at a wooden desk, copying reports about crop yields, tax collections, and local unrest. But as she read, she began to notice things others ignored. One morning, a report arrived from the Punjab region. It said the wheat harvest had failed again. Farmers were selling their land. Children were going hungry, but the note at the bottom, written in red ink by a senior officer, said, "Do not forward to London. No need to alarm the public. Keep calm. Maintain order." Eleanor stared at those words. No need to alarm the public. But the public in Punjab was starving. She looked around the office. No one else seemed troubled. They sipped tea, sharpened pencils, and filed the report under routine matters. Later that week, she met Mr. Hargrove, the head of the department. He was a man in his 50s with a thin mustache and a voice like dry leaves. He called her into his office, which smelled of old books and cigar smoke. "Miss Thorne," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've been asking questions about the Punjab report." She nodded. "I only wondered why it wasn't sent to London. If the harvest failed, shouldn't the government know?" Mr. Hargrove smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "My dear, you're new here. There's a rule we all follow, though no one writes it down. It's simple, don't wake the humans," Eleanor frowned. "The humans?" "Yes," he said, tapping his temple. "The people back home. The voters. The newspapers. The ladies who drink tea in Kensington. They believe the empire is strong, clean, and just. If we tell them the truth, that crops are failing, that people are angry, that our officers sometimes use whips and guns to keep order, they'll panic. They'll demand changes we can't afford. Or worse, they'll lose faith." He leaned forward. "Our job isn't to tell the truth. It's to keep the machine running. Smoothly, quietly, without noise." Eleanor left his office feeling uneasy. That night, she walked along the Hooghly River. The air was thick with the smell of spices and river mud. She watched a group of laborers carrying sacks of rice off a boat. Their backs were bent, their clothes torn. One man coughed deeply, then kept walking. She thought of London, of parks, of gaslights, of people reading poetry. They didn't know, and someone had decided they shouldn't. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor began to see the rule everywhere. When a village protested a new tax, the local officer wrote, "Minor disturbance. Settled peacefully." But Eleanor heard from a messenger that soldiers had fired into the crowd. When a flood destroyed homes in Bengal, the report said, "Local aid provided." But no aid had come. The truth was buried under neat handwriting and official stamps. She tried to speak up once. At a staff meeting, she suggested sending a summary of real conditions to the Colonial Office in London. The room went quiet. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Miss Thorne," he said gently, "enthusiasm is admirable. But remember, the empire is like a sleeping giant. If you wake it with bad news, it might thrash about and break everything, including us." No one met her eyes after that. She felt alone, like a single candle in a dark room. Still, she couldn't stop noticing. She started keeping her own notes, small hidden pages in a leather-bound book. She wrote down what she saw, how much rice was really being taken from farmers, how many complaints were ignored, how often the word peaceful was used to describe violence. She didn't plan to do anything with the notes. She just needed to remember the truth. One afternoon, a young Indian clerk named Arjun slipped a letter into her hand when no one was looking. He worked in the records room and had seen her reading the real reports, not just the cleaned-up versions. The letter said, "They call it order. We call it silence. But silence feeds hunger. Eleanor read it 3 times. Her hands shook. She looked for Arjun later, but he avoided her. She understood why. Speaking out could cost him his job or his life. That night, she sat by her small oil lamp and opened her secret book. She wrote, "The one rule is, don't wake the humans. But what if the humans are us? What if we are the ones asleep?" She didn't have an answer, but for the first time, she felt the weight of the lie she was helping to carry. Days turned into weeks. The heat grew worse. Monsoon clouds gathered in the distance. In the office, the same routine continued. Reports came in. Lies went out. Tea was served at 4. Eleanor kept copying. She smiled when expected. She nodded when spoken to. But inside, something had changed. She no longer believed the Empire was a force for good. She saw it now as a great machine, oiled with silence, powered by denial. And the rule, don't wake the humans, was the key that kept it running. But machines break, and sleep doesn't last forever. One evening, as she walked home, she passed a group of children playing near a broken well. They were laughing, chasing each other, their bare feet kicking up dust. One boy wore a torn shirt with the faded emblem of a British school. He looked up and saw her. He didn't smile. He just stared as if he knew something she didn't. Eleanor walked faster. Her heart beat hard. She reached her small room, locked the door, and sat on her bed. Outside, the city hummed with life. Cooking fires, arguing neighbors, temple bells. The Empire felt very far away. She opened her secret book again. On a fresh page, she wrote, "If we keep sleeping, who will save them when the storm comes?" She didn't know it yet, but the storm was already on its way, and the rule that had held the Empire together for so long would soon be the very thing that tore it apart. For now, though, she closed the book, blew out the lamp, and tried to sleep, like everyone else. 10 years passed. The world changed, but the rule stayed the same. Don't wake the humans. Eleanor Thorne was no longer the young clerk with wide eyes and quiet questions. She was now 36, with silver strands in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from too many sleepless nights. She had been promoted. Her title was Senior Advisor for Regional Affairs. But in truth, she was still a keeper of secrets, only now she held more of them. She worked in a larger office, in a newer building, but the air still smelled of paper, ink, and fear. The British Empire still stretched across the map, but cracks were showing. In Ireland, men and women spoke openly of freedom. In Egypt, crowds gathered near the Suez Canal, angry about British control. In Kenya, farmers refused to give up their land for white settlers. Yet in London, newspapers called these small troubles, and Parliament spoke of loyal subjects and peaceful rule. Eleanor knew better. She read the real reports, the ones not meant for public eyes. She saw how soldiers in Nairobi used whips to force labor. She read how Egyptian workers were paid almost nothing to dig canals that made British ships rich. She saw how Irish families were thrown out of their homes for not paying rent to English landlords. Each report ended the same way. Situation under control. No need for alarm in London. But Eleanor felt the alarm growing inside her. It was like a fire in her chest, small but hot. One morning, a new officer arrived in Calcutta, Captain James Bell. He was young, clean-shaven, and full of energy. He had just returned from Malaya, where he helped calm a rebellion by locking village leaders in jail without trial. At a staff meeting, he spoke proudly. "We showed them who's in charge. No violence needed, just firm action." Eleanor looked up. Were they given a chance to speak? To explain why they were angry? Captain Bell blinked. "They were breaking the law, Miss Thorne. Lawbreakers don't get speeches," she didn't argue. But later she pulled the file on Malaya. Buried in the notes was a line. Villagers claimed their rice fields were taken for rubber plantations without payment. The report called it unverified rumor. But Eleanor had seen the same pattern before. Land taken. People silenced, truth erased. That night, she added it to her secret book. She had kept it all these years, hidden under a loose floorboard in her room. The book was thick now, filled with names, dates, and quiet cries for help that no one in London would ever hear. She often thought of Arjun, the young clerk who gave her that note years ago. He had disappeared soon after, transferred, they said. But no one knew where. She never saw him again. Now new clerks came and went. Some asked questions. Most learned quickly to stop. One day, a letter arrived from London. It was from a man named Thomas Reed, a journalist who wrote for a small newspaper that sometimes questioned government actions. He had heard rumors about problems in the colonies and wanted facts. He wrote, "If what I hear is true, the public deserves to know. We cannot call ourselves just if we hide suffering." Eleanor held the letter for a long time. Her hands trembled. She knew the risk. If she sent him real information, she could lose her job. Worse, she could be arrested for leaking secrets. But if she did nothing, the silence would grow louder. She spent 3 nights thinking. On the 4th, she copied parts of her secret notes, only the facts, no names, no opinions. She changed places and dates slightly so no one could trace them back to her. Then in the dark hours before dawn, she mailed the pages to Thomas Reed. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. She began to think the letter had been lost or ignored. Then, one Tuesday, a small article appeared in Reed's paper. It said, "Reports from India suggest crop failures and unrest are being downplayed by officials. Are we being told the full story?" The article was short. It had no proof, only questions. But in London, it caused a stir. A few members of Parliament asked for a review. The Colonial Office sent a sharp reply, "No basis for concern. All matters are handled properly." The story died in 2 days. But in Calcutta, Mr. Hargrove called Eleanor into his office. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse her. He just looked at her over his glasses and said, "Some fires start with a single match, Eleanor. We must not light them." She said nothing. He sighed. "You're too smart for your own good. But remember, our duty is to protect the empire, not to question it. The public sleeps because we let them, and that sleep keeps peace." She left his office feeling cold, even in the heat. That same week, news came from Kenya. A group of men had burned a government office. In response, British soldiers rounded up hundreds of villagers. Many were beaten. Some disappeared. The official report called it a swift restoration of order. Eleanor read it and felt sick. She thought of the children she saw playing near the well years ago. Were they now among the angry young men in Kenya? Had silence turned into rage? She began to see the truth more clearly. The rule "don't wake the humans" wasn't just about protecting London. It was about protecting power. As long as the British public believed the empire was good, they would support it. But if they knew the truth, that it was built on fear, force, and lies, they might stop believing. And without belief, the empire would fall. So the system kept lying, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change, fear of waking up. Eleanor tried to do her job. She signed papers. She attended meetings. She nodded when she was supposed to. But inside, she felt like a ghost walking through a dream. One evening, she took a walk through the old part of Calcutta. She passed a school where Indian boys in uniforms recited English poems. She saw a British officer buying fruit from a street vendor, handing over coins without looking the man in the eye. She heard a radio playing a song from London, soft, sweet, and far away. It all felt fragile, like glass. She returned to her room and opened her secret book. She wrote, "We are building a house on sand, and we keep telling ourselves the ground is solid." She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending. A few days later, Captain Bell came to her with a new report from Nigeria. Farmers there were refusing to grow cotton for British mills. They wanted to grow food for their families instead. "They're being unreasonable," Bell said. "We may need to send troops." Eleanor looked at him. "Have you asked why they refuse?" "They don't understand economics," he replied. "Or maybe," she said quietly, "they understand it too well." He stared at her, confused. Then he left. That night she made a decision. She would keep collecting the truth. Not to cause trouble, but to be ready. Because she knew, deep down, that one day the humans would wake up. And when they did, someone would need to tell them what really happened while they slept. She didn't know when that day would come. But she could feel it coming, like thunder before rain. For now, she closed her book, blew out her lamp, and listened to the sounds of the city. Alive, restless, and waiting. The empire still stood. But its foundation was cracking, and the rule that once kept it strong was now its greatest weakness. Eleanor lay in the dark and wondered, when the fall comes, will anyone remember the ones who tried to speak? She didn't have an answer, but she would keep writing, because silence, she now knew, was not peace. It was just the quiet before the storm. The year was 1919. The Great War was over, but the world felt heavier, not lighter. Millions had died in muddy trenches across Europe. Empires had shaken. New ideas, freedom, self-rule, justice, were spreading like wind through dry grass. In India, soldiers who had fought for Britain returned home with medals on their chests and questions in their hearts. They had seen white men bleed like anyone else. They had heard speeches about democracy in Paris and London. Now they asked, if we are equal in war, why are we not equal at home? Eleanor Thorne, now 42, watched these changes from her office in Calcutta. She wore the same plain dresses, kept the same quiet manner, but her eyes held a new kind of sadness. She had seen the war's cost, not just in lives, but in trust. The empire had asked colonies to bleed for it. Now it refused to listen when they asked for fairness in return. One April morning, news came from Amritsar, a city in northern India. A peaceful gathering of men, women, and children had met in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh. They were protesting new laws that let British officers arrest anyone without reason. They carried no weapons. They sang songs. They waited for speeches. Then, without warning, a British officer named General Dyer ordered his troops to block the only exit and open fire. Hundreds were killed. Men fell over women. Children screamed under piles of bodies. The shooting lasted 10 minutes. When it ended, the ground was red. The report that reached Calcutta said, "Unlawful assembly dispersed. Order restored." Eleanor read it and felt her stomach drop. She knew this was not order. This was terror. Within days, more details leaked through whispers, through letters from doctors, through Indian newspapers that dared to print the truth. Over 370 dead, more than 1,000 wounded. No warning, no chance to run. Eleanor sat at her desk, her hands cold. She thought of the children playing near the well years ago. Could one of them have been in that garden? She went to Mr. Hargrove, now older, slower but still holding tight to the old rule. "We must tell London what really happened," she said. He looked tired. "Eleanor, you know how this works. If the truth gets out, the public will panic. Politicians will fight. The empire will look weak. We already look cruel," she replied. He shook his head. "Cruelty can be hidden. Weakness cannot." But this time, the truth would not stay hidden. A few weeks later, an Indian doctor who had treated the wounded traveled to London. He spoke to reporters. He showed photographs. He described how people bled into the dry earth, how families searched for days for missing sons and daughters. British newspapers, which once called colonial protests minor disturbances, now printed headlines like, "Massacre in India," and "Is this British justice?" For the first time in decades, the humans were waking up. In London, people argued in pubs and parlors. Some said General Dyer was a hero who saved India from rebellion. Others called him a murderer. A few brave members of Parliament demanded an investigation. Back in Calcutta, Eleanor watched the change with hope and fear. Hope because the lie was cracking. Fear because she knew how hard the system would fight to stay asleep. Then something unexpected happened. A secret committee was formed in Parliament to review colonial affairs. They needed someone who knew the truth but wouldn't cause a scandal. Someone quiet, someone loyal but honest. They asked for Eleanor Thorne. She was summoned to London, not as a clerk, not as a note-taker, but as a witness. She packed a small suitcase. She left her secret book hidden under the floorboard just in case. She took only her memory, her notes from official files, and a single photograph of the Jallianwala Bagh garden, sent to her by a nurse who had been there. The journey by ship took weeks. The sea was calm, but her mind was not. When she arrived in London, the city felt strange, clean, cold, and quiet. No shouting vendors. No smell of spices or dust. Just stone buildings and gray skies. She was taken to a small room in the House of Commons. No grand hall. No audience. Just 5 men in suits sitting behind a long table. One of them, an old man with kind eyes, said, "Miss Thorne, we've heard you've worked in India for over 20 years. We want your honest view, not the official story." The real one. Eleanor took a deep breath. For the first time, she was being asked to break the rule. She spoke slowly. She told them about the crop reports that were changed, about protests called peaceful when they were crushed with guns, about how officers were rewarded for silence, not truth. She described Amritsar not with anger but with facts, names, numbers, dates. She did not call the empire evil, but she said it was blind. And blindness, she said, leads to mistakes that cannot be undone. The men listened. Some took notes. One looked away. When she finished, the kind-eyed man said, "Thank you. Your words will help us." But as she left the building, she saw the truth in their faces. They were not ready to wake up fully. They wanted just enough truth to calm the public, not enough to change the system. A few weeks later, the committee released its report. It criticized General Dyer, but gently. It called the shooting a regrettable error, not a crime. Dyer was removed from duty, but many in Britain called him a hero. Newspapers printed letters saying, "He saved us from another Indian mutiny." The Empire had acknowledged the wound but refused to treat the sickness. Eleanor stayed in London for a while, hoping for more. But nothing changed. The same men stayed in power. The same rules applied. The public, after a few weeks of outrage, returned to their lives. The humans had opened their eyes for a moment, then closed them again. Disheartened, Eleanor returned to India. On the ship back, she met a young Indian man named Rajiv. He had studied law in London and was now going home to join the freedom movement led by a man named Gandhi. "You spoke to them," he said to her one evening on deck. "Did they listen?" She looked at the dark water. "They heard, but they did not understand," Rajiv nodded. "They never will. They think the empire is theirs to fix, but it is ours to free." His words stayed with her. Back in Calcutta, everything felt the same, but nothing was. The silence now felt heavier. The rule, "Don't wake the humans," why was still spoken, but it rang hollow. People knew the truth now. Even if London pretended not to, India remembered. Eleanor went back to her office. Her desk was the same, her title unchanged, but she was different. She no longer believed the system could be fixed from inside. It was built on silence, and silence could not hold forever. That night, she took out her secret book. She added a new page. She wrote, "I tried to wake them gently, but some sleeps are too deep. Maybe the only way to wake them is to let the dream end." She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing. She would not hide the truth again. A few months later, Gandhi began his campaign of nonviolent protest. He asked Indians to make their own salt, to wear homespun cloth, to refuse to obey unjust laws. Thousands joined him. The empire called it disorder, but Eleanor saw it for what it was, a people waking up, and this time, they would not go back to sleep. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, no longer a servant of the system, but not yet a rebel either. She was in between, like a bridge between two worlds. One evening, she received a small package. Inside was a book of Gandhi's writings. Tucked in the pages was a note in familiar handwriting. "Thank you for speaking. Now it is our turn." It was signed with a single initial, A. Arjun. Her heart leaped. He was alive, and he was fighting. She held the book close. Outside, the city buzzed with new energy. Banners hung in streets. Songs of freedom rose from courtyards. The empire still stood, but its shadow was shrinking. Eleanor sat by her window and watched the sunset. For the first time in years, she felt not fear but peace. The humans were waking, and this time they would not be put back to sleep. The 1930s came with hard times. Money was tight everywhere. Factories closed. People stood in long lines for bread. In London, men wore worn coats and women patched their children's shoes. The Great Depression had reached even the heart of the empire, but in the colonies the pain was deeper. While Britain cut its own costs, it took more from India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Taxes rose, crops were taken, jobs disappeared. And still the old rule held, "Don't wake the humans." Eleanor Thorne was now in her 50s. Her hair was mostly gray and she moved more slowly, but her mind was sharp. She still worked for the government, though her role had changed. She no longer wrote reports for London. Instead, she reviewed others' work, quietly correcting lies, softening harsh words, trying to keep some truth alive inside the machine. But the machine was breaking. In India, a man named Gandhi led a march to the sea. He walked for miles with thousands behind him, all to make salt from seawater, a simple act but against British law. The world watched. Newspapers in America and Europe printed photos of peaceful men and women beaten by police for picking up salt. In London, people saw the pictures and asked, "Why are we doing this?" The government answered, "To keep order." But the word order no longer sounded right. It sounded like fear. Eleanor read the cables from Delhi. Officers begged for more troops. "The people are not afraid anymore," one wrote. Another said, "They smile when we arrest them. They sing in jail." She knew what this meant. Fear had been the glue holding the empire together. Now that glue was drying up. One day, a young officer from Kenya came to her office. His name was David Moore. He looked tired, his uniform wrinkled, his eyes shadowed. "They burned 3 farms last week," he said, not with anger, with joy, like they were free already. Eleanor poured him tea. "And what did you do?" "We arrested the leaders, but new ones appear every day," she nodded. "You cannot arrest an idea." He looked at her surprised. "What idea?" "Freedom." He left soon after, confused. That same week, news came from Nigeria. Women had gathered by the thousands to protest new taxes. They wore bright cloth and sang old songs. British officers, not knowing what to do, fired into the crowd. Many women died. The report called it a regrettable incident. Eleanor tore the page in half. She was done pretending. That night, she took her secret book, the one she had kept for over 20 years, and copied its most important pages. She changed no names this time. She added dates, places, and real quotes from real reports. She wrote about Amritsar, about Kenya, about Nigeria, about the lies told to London year after year. Then, under a different name, E.T. Walker, she wrote a short book. She called it The Quiet Cost. It was not angry. It was calm. It simply told what happened, with facts, not feelings. She sent the manuscript to a small publisher in Manchester who was known for printing honest books, even unpopular ones. Weeks passed. She heard nothing. Then one rainy morning a package arrived. Inside was a copy of her book. The cover was plain brown paper, black letters, but it was real. She held it like a child. The book sold slowly at first. Only a few hundred copies, but teachers read it. Students passed it around. A priest in Liverpool quoted it in a sermon. A radio host in Glasgow read a chapter on air. The government tried to ignore it. Then, when it wouldn't go away, they called it the work of a bitter woman with no love for her country. But the damage was done. People began to ask questions again. Why are we still ruling people who don't want us? Is it right to take their land, their crops, their freedom? What if the empire is not a gift but a burden? In Parliament, a few brave voices spoke up. "We must change," they said, "or we will lose everything." But the old guard refused. "If we show weakness," they warned, "the whole world will fall apart." Eleanor watched it all from her small flat in Calcutta. She no longer worked for the government. She had retired quietly a year earlier, saying she was tired. No one argued. They were glad to see her go now. She spent her days reading letters from strangers, teachers, soldiers, even a few former officers who thanked her for telling the truth. One letter came from Arjun. He was now a lawyer in Delhi, working with Gandhi. He wrote, "Your words gave us proof. Not just hope, proof. Thank you for not staying silent," she cried that day. Then the war came. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Once again, the empire was called to fight. Men from India, Africa, and the Caribbean joined the army. They sailed across oceans to defend a country many had never seen. Eleanor watched with a heavy heart. They fight for freedom in Europe, she told a friend, but not for themselves at home. The war drained Britain. Ships sank. Cities burned. Money vanished. By 1945, Britain was exhausted. It had won the war but lost its strength, and the colonies had changed. While British soldiers fought in Europe, Indian leaders built schools, courts, and councils of their own. They showed they could govern themselves. In Africa, new voices rose, men and women who spoke of independence, not loyalty. The empire could no longer pretend. In 1947, the British government made a decision. India would be free, not because of war, not because of violence, but because Britain could no longer afford the lie. The news came on a hot August day. Eleanor sat on her porch listening to the radio. The announcer's voice was calm. At midnight, India becomes independent. Outside, the city exploded with joy. People ran in the streets waving flags, crying, laughing. Firecrackers popped. Songs filled the air. Eleanor did not join them. She sat quietly, tears on her cheeks. She thought of the young clerk she once was, the one who believed in duty and order. She thought of Mr. Hargrove, who told her, "Don't wake the humans." She thought of the children by the well, the farmers in Punjab, the women in Nigeria, the men in Kenya. They had all woken up, and the empire, built on silence, had fallen not with a bang, but with a whisper. A few weeks later, she received a letter from London. It was from Thomas Reed, the journalist she had sent notes to so long ago. He was old now, like her. He wrote, "You were right. We were asleep. And when we woke, the world had changed. Thank you for trying to wake us gently." She folded the letter and placed it in her old secret book, now empty of secrets, full of history. She walked to the market that day. No one recognized her. She was just an old woman in a faded dress. But as she passed a school, she heard children reciting in Hindi, not English. She saw a shop with a sign that said, "Made in India." She smelled spices, not tea from England. The humans were awake, and the empire was in ruins, not broken by enemies, but undone by its own silence. Eleanor bought a small bag of rice and walked home. The sun was warm. The air was free. She knew more changes would come. Africa would rise. The Caribbean would speak. The world would shift. But for now, in this quiet moment, she felt peace. The rule was broken. The truth had won, and the sleeping giant had finally opened its eyes. By the late 1950s, the British Empire was little more than a memory. Maps had been redrawn. Flags had changed. Countries once marked in pink, Britain's color, now flew green, gold, red, and white. In London, people spoke of the Commonwealth instead of the Empire, as if changing the name could soften the truth. But the truth was plain. The world had moved on. Eleanor Thorne was 70 years old. Her hands trembled now, and she walked with a cane, but her mind was clear. She lived in a small flat in London, not because she wanted to, but because her health made travel hard. She missed Calcutta, the heat, the noise, the smell of jasmine after rain. But she stayed, watching the old world fade from her window. The colonial office, once a grand building full of busy men in suits, was nearly empty. Files were boxed and stored in dusty basements. Young clerks who once dreamed of serving in Nairobi or Rangoon now looked for jobs in banks or schools. The empire had not fallen in a single day. It had unraveled slowly, like a rope worn thin by years of silence and strain. One gray morning, Eleanor received a letter from the government. It was polite, formal, and cold. It said the colonial office would close next month. All remaining records would be moved to the National Archives. They asked if she, as a former senior advisor, would like to visit one last time. She said yes. The day she arrived, the building felt hollow. Echoes bounced off marble floors. Portraits of old governors stared down with proud, distant eyes. She walked slowly down the hallway where she had spent most of her life. Her old office was empty, just a desk, a chair, and a cracked window. She sat in the chair and closed her eyes. She could almost hear the scratch of pens, the rustle of papers, the quiet coughs of men afraid to speak too loud. A young man in a Navy uniform approached. He was an archivist tasked with packing the final boxes. "Miss Thorne," he asked gently, "we found something with your name on it." He handed her a small wooden box. Inside was her secret book, the one she had hidden under the floorboard in Calcutta all those years ago. Someone long ago must have sent it to London for safekeeping. It had been forgotten in a drawer labeled only Personal E.T. Her breath caught. She opened it. The pages were yellow, the ink faded, but every word was still there. The crop failures, the protests, the lies, the truth. She ran her fingers over the lines she had written as a young woman, full of fear and hope. She saw the date of the Amritsar entry, the note from Arjun, the line she wrote after the war. "Silence is not peace." The young man waited quietly. "Do you know what this is?" She asked him. He shook his head. "Just old notes, I suppose." She smiled faintly. "It's the story of how an empire fell, not because it was attacked, but because it refused to see itself." He didn't understand, but he nodded kindly. She kept the book. The rest of the files would go to archives, to be studied by historians or left to gather dust. But this book was hers. That afternoon, as she walked out of the building for the last time, She passed a group of schoolchildren on a tour. Their teacher pointed to a map on the wall, a map of the world from 1920 with huge pink patches. That, the teacher said, was the British Empire. It ruled a quarter of the world. One boy raised his hand. Why did it end? The teacher hesitated. Well, times changed. People wanted freedom. Eleanor stopped and listened. Another child asked, was it bad? The teacher chose her words carefully. It did good things and bad things. History is complicated. Eleanor wanted to say more. She wanted to tell them about the rule. Don't wake the humans. She wanted to explain how silence can look like strength but is really weakness. How ignoring truth doesn't make it go away, it just makes the fall harder. But she said nothing. She walked on. Later that week, a young woman came to her flat. Her name was Clara, a university student writing a paper on women and the end of empire. She had read The Quiet Cost, Eleanor's book, and wanted to meet the author. They sat by the window with tea. Clara was bright-eyed, full of questions. Why did you write it? She asked. Because someone had to remember, Eleanor said. If no one writes down what really happened, the powerful will write their own story. And their story always leaves out the pain. Clara nodded. Do you think the empire could have lasted if it had been honest? Eleanor looked out at the street. A bus passed, painted red, not pink. No, she said softly. An empire built on control cannot survive truth. Truth gives people power, and once they have it, they won't give it back. They talked for hours about Gandhi, about Kenya, about the cost of silence. Clara took careful notes. Before she left, she asked, What's the lesson for us today? Eleanor thought a long time. Then she said, When you build a world on a lie, even the smallest truth can bring it down. So don't hide the truth, even when it's hard. Even when you're told to stay quiet. Clara smiled. I'll remember that. After she left, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet flat. Rain began to fall outside, tapping gently on the glass. She opened her old book one more time. On the last page she had written years ago, I do not know if anyone will read this, but if they do, I hope they learn this. Power without honesty is just fear in a fancy coat. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside her. That night, she dreamed of Calcutta. She saw the river, the markets, the children playing near the well, but this time they were laughing freely. No soldiers, no fear. Just life, loud and bright and real. When she woke, the rain had stopped. Morning light filled the room. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched London wake up. A city no longer ruling the world, but still part of it. Smaller, perhaps, but maybe wiser. She thought of Mr. Hargrove, long gone. She wondered if, in his final days, he understood. She hoped he did. The empire was in ruins, not broken by war or rebellion alone, but by its own refusal to face the truth. The rule, don't wake the humans, Girls had been meant to protect it. Instead, it sealed its fate, because the humans were not just the people in London. They were the farmers in Punjab, the women in Nigeria, the students in Delhi. They were everyone who had been told to be quiet, to wait, to obey. And when they finally woke, they did not ask for permission. They took their freedom. Eleanor sipped her tea. She felt no bitterness, only peace. She had spent her life inside a system that valued silence over truth. But in the end, she chose truth. And that choice, small as it seemed at the time, had mattered. Outside, a bird sang. Somewhere, a child laughed. The world went on, changed, healing, learning. Eleanor Thorne closed her eyes and smiled. The sleeping giant was awake. And the ruins, they were not an end. They were the ground where something new could grow.